Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm excited to be speaking with Dr. Jon Rhodes. Jon, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me back, Dan. Thank you.
It's great to have you back. Second time on. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I am one of the co-founders of Imagery Coaching, which is a company which is really focused on looking at how to train people to use their imagination. I'm also based at the University of Plymouth, where I lecture and do lots of researchy stuff there, mostly around imagination and imagery, exercise adherence. And I feel really old when I say this, but I feel like I've been it feels like it's been about 3 years, but I've been in sport for about 15 years now, which kind of ages me. So working with high performance teams, medium performance teams, and low performance teams, the whole lot. And looking at individuals who are starting in sport through to those who are competing at multiple Olympic Games. And again, a lot of my work at the minute is focused around military as well. So I work a lot with the British Army. And yeah, just think all things imagination training or imagery-based training that we do. And also we're now working across the corporate field as well. So we're doing a lot of work with corporate organizations, and we're using imagery with teams as well, which I'm sure we're going to get onto later on. So yeah, lots of different things.
Absolutely. And you've written and recently released a new book, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We're going to unpack this book. It's called The Choice Point, the scientifically proven method for achieving your goals. And you've written that alongside your colleague, Joanna Grover. Tell us a little bit about the genesis of this book. I know you sort of muttered to me it was in the pipeline when we last spoke. So congratulations on completing it and releasing it. Exciting times, Jon. Tell us a little bit about the beginnings of this book.
Well, yeah, I think there's always been a book in me somewhere, and it's just about timing. We started it at the end of COVID, and it was just that need to share a story. And again, a lot of the research, a lot of the functional imagery training research that we'll talk about is housed in academia in a way. So unless you read academic papers that are all peer reviewed and rigorously kind of empirical, then you'll be aware of functional imagery training. But the majority of people, especially in sport, are not overly aware of it. So again, it's writing a book so that anyone can pick up, and apply pretty much instantaneously and learn more about their imagination, but also assess their imagination and look at how to develop a framework. We're big on mental frameworks. How can we use imagery in our daily practice, and how can we have that universal language around what we're thinking, what we're perceiving, how we're acting, our intentions, and really putting that into force in a very rigorous way. So that was the thought behind it was kind of translating it from the academic world into the popular science world. But yeah, it was quite nice to have to be writing alongside Joe, and Joe really writes. We always say that with a head and the heart, and she perceives me as being the head and her the heart. But what it really is, it's a combination of the science and then the anecdotes of like the stories that go alongside it. People have used it, those who are CEOs of organizations through to, Red Bull, cliff divers, and all sorts of people who use functional imagery training in that more rigorous way. So a lot of their stories are in there, and hopefully you can pick it up and you will use it within minutes. So that was the aim really for the book.
Sounds like Joe is a perfect writing partner for you there. They always say a great team has complementarity, so perfect.
For sure, yeah, for sure. And it's interesting as well because, two different styles, we had to merge the styles together.
Yeah.
So we also had a coach to work with us as well, because of course when you start this whole this whole journey of writing a book, and your initial ideas, of course some of them are shelved and some of them come to fruition. So it was good to have someone a good team alongside us as well, like you would in any kind of team. You have your creatives that really support you to to kind of get you to that finish line. So it was a good team with it.
This is the Sports Psych show, so I'm sure we'll try to unpack this with our audience in mind, with sports coaches and sports fanatics in mind, even though the book obviously goes way beyond sports, like so many sports psychology topics and subject matters do. And talking about sport, your foreword, you've gone straight to the top here, Jon. One of the greatest tennis players of all time, Martina Navratilova, introducing the book. I mean, great job here.
Yeah, no, super kind of her as well, and she was going through cancer at that point as well. So taking the time out to write for us was really super kind. And I think when people read books and they say, you know what, I've used this, I've used imagery all my life, and actually, when I was at Wimbledon, what she would say, that imagery was part of a process, and it's interesting, when we spoke to her, because a lot of those stories around Wimbledon and against opponents, especially around those times as well, really revolved around perception, or revolved around imagining the points, imagining what the conversations might be like, even imagining the interviews as well afterwards. So those things, are part of her story, and we're really fortunate to have her. To Martina, really, do a great job. To be fair, I would buy the book just for the forward.
It is a good forward. It's an interesting forward, in as much as I suppose we in sports psychology speak so much these days about, and hey, look, we're going to go on to talk about this, I'm sure, in more detail, but aligning imagery with the process, if you like, possibly more so than outcomes. But actually, Martina Navratilova talks, as you've been saying there, about utilizing imagery in line with seeing herself pick up the trophy, and seeing herself thinking about everything surrounding the game. And as I say, Jon, for me, so much of my work is actually trying to steer people more towards a what I would consider to be a deeper, more meaningful sense of imagery around the process, no question. But I noticed that in the foreword.
Yeah, and throughout as well, that whole idea around goals. We see it in three phases. So we see it in that kind of big end goal, and you can go beyond the end goal, of course, because you can say, well, what happens beyond Wimbledon? Okay, yes, you lift the trophy up. Then what happens? The day after as well. What are the conversations like beyond that? Some people want to imagine that. A lot of people don't want to imagine that. They just want to get to that end point. So that's the phase one, which is that real outcome. And then you have that, what's along the journey? What are the obstacles along the journey? Based imagery along that timeline. And really, for us, when we use imagery is like time travel, right? We can go back into the past and we can analyze what's happened, and we can likewise go into the future and say, well, what happens if I win this competition, or if I lose it, what will happen? What's the outcome going to be like? So again, along that timeline, the detail that you use to imagine is really quite critical, all the way back to, as you're saying, Dan, back to, what am I going to do today? Like, what's the imagery based on my process goal of, maybe it's my footwork, maybe it's the distance I'm to a defender, whatever it could be. Imagine it, and then how can we implement it as well? So, as I say, imagery for us happens really, like what Martina was saying, along three lines almost. That big goal, medium-based goals, and then immediate process goals.
And I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but again, just sticking with Navratilova here for a few seconds. As I was reading, it was making me think of the robust nature of imagery, how it can impact so many different psychological processes. Navratilova really talking about what imaging outcomes to potentially increase her feelings of confidence, her experience of self-belief. We can think of those typical classical C's: concentration, commitment, control, in a group setting, communication, cohesion, and so on and so forth. Imagery is such a robust tool that hits so many different psychological processes.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I think also, like, as you touched upon there, as soon as you have a goal, 98% of people will imagine it. 2% often can't imagine in that visual detail will struggle with elements of vividness within their visual imagination. But 98% of people will imagine their goal visually in some way, emotionally in some way. And really, that's where you start to immerse yourself in the detail. And the detail really matters. So, with what Martina was saying, but also with, other athletes, especially in tennis. Tennis is great to work in because people talk about, even between points and how they're, the preparation for shots or whatever it could be. This is engaging your imagination. Now, imagination also isn't just seeing pictures. Imagination is also talking to yourself. The auditory based self-talk is part of your imagination, how you're talking to yourself. And then, alongside it, although we call it, imagery training, it really is holistic. It really does involve like your why. It involves meaning to you. Why is this point important to you? Why is it important to inject that effort and, maintain that high output of attitude towards this exact moment? And, we can link it to lots of theories. We can talk about ACT and acceptance, commitment therapy, or training, if you want to call it training. Really, that's focused in on like what am I thinking about? What can I what part of my performance can I accept and commit to in my next action? So that's where really imagery plays a core part for us, because we can train your imagination and we can help you to refine it so that what you imagine is a lot more specific based on your process goal, but also it's really clear to you to again look at maintaining confidence and also that emotional regulation, which is so key for any athlete, or even for anyone, for all of us in all different walks of life. That kind of emotional regulation is really key, and having a framework to do it in is also really important.
Well, your book, Choice Point, is packed full of fantastic information for everybody out there, and its content is split into 3 parts. Part 1, pushing past mental walls. Part 2, reimagine your goals. And Part 3, going beyond, with 3 chapters in each part. And what I'd love to do here, Jon, is to unpack the book a little bit from part 1 through to part 3, and really allow you to drive this and give us what you feel are some of the main messages, some of the golden nuggets within each of those parts. So part 1, pushing past mental walls. Why don't you give us a little bit of an introduction into this part? What are you introducing your audience to? And take us through some of the ideas here and the thoughts.
Of course. So let's start with an imagery example. I think that's probably the best way to start for all of our listeners, Dan. Yeah. So I think we have it all the time where like today, for example, for me, I know I've got to do this presentation today. The deliverable is due, and as I'm sat here thinking about this, my mind starts to wander. And for me, I'm not sure whether you're the same as me, Dan, but my mind says, what will really help you right now is a chocolate biscuit.
I'm very much the same as you.
And I start to think about it. And so that's really, that's where my interest starts, because we have priorities. We have really important priorities. We have super important goals, but our mind often gets in the way of those goals. Healthy eating could be one. It could be going for a run in the morning, whatever it could be. And as your mind wanders, like mine did, and yours probably is now, to a chocolate biscuit, you start to then elaborate on that detail. Now, elaboration is really where this first chapter is based in. And elaboration, now, functional imagery training is based on what's called the elaboration intrusion theory. And what that means is it means that when you elaborate on something, you give it attention, and the detail then it creates this need or this desire to ultimately get a chocolate biscuit in this case. And there's a deficit, right? A deficit between your future self. How good would it be to eat that chocolate biscuit? And you might say, it would taste like this, and it will smell like that. And in my fingers, it'll feel like this. And you elaborate, you give it more detail. And there's a deficit, right, between the future you and you right now doing this work. So that deficit is usually followed up with a craving or a behavior. You go and get the chocolate biscuit and then you come back to your work, maybe. So that's really where the science is rooted. It's rooted in this element of elaboration. And we often find ourselves diverting from our primary task to something else. And it happens on the sports pitch, right? We are, athletes are playing, and they clearly know what their goal is and their job is, and their mind starts to wander. Now, how can you? That's the question. The question where we started years ago is, how can we divert thinking back to your goal? This is the really important part, because if you can do that, you can pretty much do a lot of these things around sticking with goals and persevering under pressure, etc. And that decision often happens within 2 seconds. Okay, so lots of the work around Daniel Kahneman and his thoughts around like how, frequency of thought. Our thoughts happen super quickly, and as psychologists, we operate in that 2-second gap quite often. So our job as psychologists, as coaches, as anyone practicing this, is to work within that window. And if we can try and prolong that decision being made of chocolate biscuit thought, and give someone some space to think about their goal, which we use cues a lot. We'll talk about cues in a moment to really activate imagery back to your desired goal. Now a cue. Let me just differentiate a cue to a trigger. Now a cue is deliberate. I know a lot. I'm fortunate enough. I go for my Friday runs, and I do a 1 hour leap. So you're always in my ear every Friday morning, Dan, and guests.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And
and does that make you run quicker or slower? Does that motivate you?
I'm consistent, to be honest. I'm consistent. and as I'm running, I'm kind of, again, elaborating on various things, and that's really important because, where your mind where your mind goes, your motivation may flow in that area as well. So again, that is a critical point for us as we really focus in on, especially in the first part of the book, is on how you elaborate, why you elaborate on certain things, and how do you regain focus, especially under pressure and under stress. So cues, I was saying cues and triggers. So a cue is deliberate. Okay. A cue is super deliberate. You plan it. A trigger is random. It just evokes a thought. I'm hungry, and my trigger is I feel hungry. I walk past some advertising somewhere, and it triggers my thoughts of, oh, wouldn't that be nice to buy a nice new car, or whatever it could be. But a cue is deliberate; it's self-planned, and so what we do is we merge a great deal of cues. You're going to call them metacognitive cues because I know what you're like. But metacognitive cues, so thinking about your cues and having meaning, the cue having a certain meaning to you, which in turn activates a thought or activates imagery. So this is really important. So when if you find yourself at the fridge door and you're going to open the fridge door and eat some cheese, maybe, because you have that deficit, the fridge handle might be your cue. Why am I here? In sport, we use it a lot with, cleaning your boots out in football or soccer. Cleaning your boots out at that moment, that's your cue to refocus on your goal. Maybe it's some form of some verbal communication. You say something to someone. It could just be distance. What does that mean? That's a cue, which then activates your imagination, and that really is where we work.
Can I reflect back to you an experience I've had in the last couple of minutes around cues, triggers, and elaboration? So you saying chocolate biscuit did actually get me thinking about chocolate. It actually got me thinking about having some crisps after this. Because for me, we're talking about elaboration. I'm elaborating on chocolate biscuit. I like a chocolate biscuit, but I prefer crisps. So I'm starting to elaborate to crisps. But I always have a flask of hot water and a mug of water, because I prefer hot water to cold water. Don't ask John. Next to me, and that acted as a bit of a cue to snap me out of thinking about the crisps. Obviously, I am still paying attention to you and the great things you're saying, but in the background, the crisps were sort of being opened. I was elaborating on those, but then I looked at my water, and that reminded me of the importance of better health, if I was to speak generally about that cue. And I started to, as you were speaking, elaborate just in the background a little bit more on that, and manage that bit of a moment there around a decision. Would that be a good example of what you're speaking to?
Yes, and to reflect back to you, because you're a you are a god at reflections and all this MI kind of areas. To reflect back to you, it sounds like health is a very important value to you that helps you navigate decisions. Would that be right?
Yes, yes, yes. At my ripe old
Right.
age, yes,
Okay.
definitely, definitely, indeed.
Okay. So this brings us very nicely to the next part in the book, in the first part, which is values. So, and this is really why as psychologists, getting to know your
Yes.
athletes is very important, because everyone's very different. Everyone's got unique values. Everyone's got their certain edge in how they see certain things, especially with their values as well. So we often start with, if not always, value tasks. Now, in the book, there are various value tasks. There's the classic value sort task that you can use to assess your values. As psychologists, we just generally have conversations, and values will emerge. And there are often things around, health and family. It could be things around excellence, like what does that look like?
Yep.
And we often look at the disconnect as well between when you're aligned with your value and when you're not. And often we stick that kind of shown up in our life as guilt. There are other things it will show up as, but often you'll feel guilty. Like, so for me, not to draw anyone else, if I don't go for a run, at least 4 times a week, I feel a little bit guilty. So I need to make the time for that, and I commit. I need to make sure I commit to what I've decided to do. So if I miss a run, it's not the end of the world, but to be aligned with my values and to go through a day feeling great and without guilt, I need to know my values. I need to wear my values, and they need to show up on my calendar. So that's really quite key. So when I talk to people again, I say, "Tell me a bit about your values." I think people might say, "Oh, that's really easy. Honesty, integrity. Okay, what values show up all the time? Okay, give me some values that show up. Sustainability and nature could be okay. Winning and excellence. Okay, show me that on your calendar. Like, how do you put it into action? So that's the really key part for us, is being able to action your values. Now, functional imagery training as a whole, before we jumped ahead quite a lot here, but functional imagery training as a whole is motivational interviewing combined with imagery training. Now, motivational interviewing alone, the person-centered approach as it's supposed to be, developed by Roenick and Miller, is a superbly effective way at sticking to goals and looking at behavior change. Combined with imagery, now it's 5 times more effective within our research. So 5 times more effective at what? In compared to what? So weight loss. We have a research in weight loss clinical trial done by Solbrig and colleagues at the University of Plymouth, where they found that motivational interviewing alone, when compared with the fit approach, so with imagery, you're 5 times more effective to lose weight and to keep the weight off for a year. And then in our research looking at exercise adherence, we took a group of non-runners, self-proclaimed non-runners, and we split them into 2 groups ultimately, and said, do you want to do an ultra marathon? And we had individuals, they were not athletes, who stuck to this goal, and they were 5 times more likely to finish an ultra. So again, that's in the book, but this is really our kind of initial research. We've got loads of other studies that we looked at, which are either in peer review, or we are busy writing away and doing our best to get things through to get published, with similar findings. So similar in the military as well, where they're exposed to either a control group motivational interviewing or combining it with imagery training, so fit. And people are, as I say, 5 times more likely to, just over 5 times more likely to stick to goals. So that's super exciting for us, but it really starts with values. Like, unless you know what your values are, and are your values aligned to your goal, then, you spoke right at the start, Dan, about purpose and meaning. Unless you're connected to purpose and meaning, then when it gets tricky, sometimes the goal may come into conflict, and you may have this point of mental mutiny, as we call it, which is, how you hijack yourself and you sabotage your best your best intentions for that short term fix of, in your case, the crisps.
Well, you threw me a bit of reflection earlier, and I'm going to throw you an affirmation back here. Just rewinding slightly. I love the way you use a bit of introjected regulation from self-determination theory to motivate you to do some running. That idea of guilt, I feel guilty, which is still slightly. DC and Ryan might call that. A little bit of extrinsic motivation, but more intrinsic than reward and punishment. So don't we sound like two psychologists here? So an affirmation back at your reflection. I love everything you're saying. I know commitment is a big part of this as well. Before we move on to part two, committing. Well, you write about commitment within this part. What's commitment got to do with this?
Yeah, so commitment really is back to crossing a point of no return. So it's the Rubicon of commitment, and often people will have this point, and they'll be it'll be a point that they're super aware of. Like, they'll say, I sat down, I had a conversation with my family, whatever it could be, and I said, what would it take for us to be all in? Like, what does that look like? Now, I say all in. I mean, all in harmony, all in balance, all in together, connected, and deliberate. So commitment, when you focus on a goal, often people have plan A. This is my plan A, and this is what it's going to take to get to ensure that we make the most of this journey. Of course, there could be plan B and plan C and plan D. I do appreciate that progress is absolutely not black and white, and commitment has 50 shades almost. But what we often see is, with athletes especially, they say, I am committed, and committed is very different from motivation. Now, if I were to argue this with other psychologists, they'll say, well, surely commitment is just one extreme of a scale. Well, yeah, okay, I do see that argument, but also what the way that we see it is, it's like a light switch. So where motivation is your dimmer switch, it's on, but it's pretty dark today. Oh, hang on a second, I'll turn it all the way up, and I'm super motivated. Commitment is on, or it's off. So when we talk to people about this, and again, if we were to use motivation interviewing, we might rate this on our kind of readiness to action scale. Are you ready to start now? Are you in? Are you committed? And we can get people to rate it, of course. From I'm absolutely ready. I'm an 8 out of 10. Okay, well, that's amazing affirmation. Why is it not a 6? Tell me a bit more about that. Give me some more understanding of why you've scored it an 8. But for really, when we focus on commitment, it's a on or off on our kind of light switch. And I think having that conversation with anyone around the difference between motivation and commitment is really important, because sometimes for certain things, especially working with athletes who are in extreme sports, commitment plays a really key role, because some days you may not be motivated to do certain things, but that doesn't mean you won't do it because you're committed. So that's really important to get that initial buy-in, that initial commitment, because when we start to use imagery to focus in on goals, we need to make sure that individual, the goal is the right one, and that individual can then immerse themselves in a way that they've been discussing around, change talk ultimately, and being able to sustain what behaviours they want to keep.
I love it, John, and let me just share with you my perspective on that. I absolutely love what you've just said. I think it evokes some fantastic images in and of itself, especially with the light switch and the dimmer. I've always perceived commitment as more of a cognitive, a mental process than perhaps motivation, whereas motivation feels like it's sort of cognitive and affective, as in emotional and behavioural. I'm not suggesting for 1 second commitment isn't those things, but I've always seen it more as I'm switching everything else off and I'm tuning into my why, essentially my mental process of commitment. That's the way I've always seen that.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that we in the first part, a lot of it is based on you being committed. Now, if we think about the bigger, if you work in a team, if you operate in a team, looking at that psychosocial commitment as well, you're bringing in other factors, and you're grabbing a jersey and you're saying, what does it take for us to be committed together?
Yeah.
So I think that although we're seeing it as this kind of end point almost in your goal, or not end point, but perhaps starting point in your goal, this is a real important conversation, and this is really what it is the book really is about a framework to have this universal language, to have these conversations around commitment, around motivation, around how are you thinking, how are you imagining this going, what do you perceive to be a setback, and again, I've worked with a few guys doing things like ultras. What's the Marathon des Sables?
Yep.
Run across the Sahara Desert. And there has to be an open, honest conversation before you start these kind of things to say, we're all committed. Yeah, we are. What's it like? What's the walkaway point? So although we speak about the choice point, there's also got to be a walkaway point, right? And a lot of my recent research is around resilience, and it's nothing. It's nothing like Mustafa Sakar and those guys who are the experts. But it comes down to having a universal language, or ability to have a framework, to have a chat around when times get difficult. What are we going to do together? What's it going to look like? What's the processes in order? And what can we do right now to ensure that there are systems in place to ensure that we stay in our best self throughout this journey?
Great stuff. Moving on to part 2, reimagine your goals. You invite the reader at the beginning of this part to think about imagery from a multi-sensory perspective. And when I reflect back, John, on my golf career and the few times I did win a paycheck, it was so often, when I reflect back, it was so often that I was placing a good deal of mental intensity on striving to really feel the shots I wanted to hit, to feel the club head through the ball, feel the strike, see the shot. As I'm speaking now, I can really feel the balls zip off the club, a bullet low off the club face into the air, and then a soft landing. And as I say, I suppose if I knew then what I know now, I would have put much more emphasis on having what I would consider to be a conscious multi-sensory experience of what I wanted to do, what I wanted to enact. Talk to us a little bit about this part 2, reimagine your goals, especially with an emphasis on multi-sensory imagery.
Of course. So as you said there, in terms of that multi-sensory perspective, it's really quite important for us as coaches to really ensure that our athletes are immersing themselves in elaborating in all 7 senses. So the 5 senses that plus emotion and motion is really quite important. So as you said there, thinking about the feel, the movement, the ball, the swing through your hips, the speed of your arms, etc. But also the focus on emotion as well. So we often get individuals to imagine, like long before the shot, like even before you're addressing the ball, would be you go through the whole process of what's the shot going to look like, sound like. We're not going to look at taste ultimately and that stuff at the minute, but ultimately multi-sensory detail is key, and we find 3 is the magic number, a bit like the song. So 3 is really quite key. So if you can use visual, kinesthetic around movement, and then emotional imagery, that's going to be a real important game changer for you. Now, everyone's very different in how they imagine. And this is really where a lot of my work has started, years ago, working with football clubs, and going into rooms of, 30, football players, and them saying, we don't really know imagery. We don't really use imagery a great deal. Okay. Yeah, we've heard about it and it's not really effective. So tell me how you use it. Well, I imagine the scene. I imagine what, I'm going to be playing away to so-and-so the weekend, and I can imagine the state. Well, okay, that is one of 7 senses. So you're getting 1/7 of the benefit of what you're doing. So what we need to do is we need to try and immerse you in more detail. So what we often do in that scenario is we often assess athletes to start with. So rather than just jump straight in, what I'd always do is I'll say to them, if you think about how you perform, you're going to generally talk to yourself, right? You're going to say to yourself, okay, so the tactics are this is the goal, this is the formation this week. And as you're talking to yourself, that's going to engage your imagination. So you need to be doing that as proactively as possible. And again, we can measure it. There's lots of different scales to look at imagery. And usually we look at imagery based on recall. So, for example, can you imagine the sight of a bonfire? We iterate it from that, from 0. I've got no image in my mind's eye to 10 out of 10. I can imagine it. So again, we do things like this, like random tasks, because it gives us a benchmark of where people are for their imagination. Similar for taste. So, can you taste mustard? You can probably taste crisps, right, Dan?
It depends what flavour, John. But I could taste
not
mustard, so we can stick with that if you'd like.
But then sound also. So things like, can you imagine the sound of a car horn?
Yeah.
Can you, thinking about vestibular or movement based, can you imagine kicking a ball? So again, we can assess people. And what we often see, and this is really fascinating, because some athletes will say, what are you talking about? I don't see that. And now you go to the coach and you say, and the coach says to you, "Hey, so what did you find?" You say, "Well, a couple of athletes didn't, they couldn't visually imagine." And they'll say, that's interesting, because I often describe things, and I often describe formations, or I describe tactics to them, and they look at me semi-blank and they say, I kind of understand it," and they go and try it out. And they clearly they either haven't heard me, or they can't imagine what I'm imagining. It's because we need to train their imagination, or their visual, their kinesthetic, whatever it could be. And that's really where a lot of my work these days occurs, is training people's imagination for them to be able to perceive, to predict. It's that whole piece around intuition, being really focused on being able to make good judgments. Every judgment's really a huge risk of what might happen, and in that risk is really how you're playing out in your mind's eye, in your mind's ear, what will happen. So again, we do that with individuals. We assess them, and after we've assessed them, we then train their imagination. And that's really where the magic happens, is when people start to say, I'm using this all the time. I'm using it in my sport, but I'm also using it to have better conversations with my wife, with my kids, with whatever, with my colleagues, even with my coach. I'm using it because I'm playing out what may happen first. I've got a few scenarios, what may happen, which, your brain often goes to negative. So it'll go through, you've been called in to see the coach, and your brain may say, this is going to be bad. What have I done wrong? So again, we play out both scenarios. Usually, I think there's something around, I think it's 80% of the time, your brain goes to that negative response. I think it's 95% of the time, it never happens. So again, your brain is often looking for that more negative imagined outcome. So we look at both scenarios. Like, what's more of a rational scenario? What's the good? What would be the successful outcome in this scenario? And then we use multisensory imagery play those scenarios out.
Can you speak a little bit to the sense of emotion? I think it might surprise people to hear you include emotion within that. And I think some people listening in might feel that that's slightly esoteric. Or how do I sense emotion? What can trigger that? Or what can help that? Or how does that actually work here? Can you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, of course. So we can assess emotion through, we can say, can you feel relieved? What does it feel? What does relief feel like? And then, I mean, that's a single sense. But of course, if we add an episode to that as well, as in a scenario, we say, well, where were you last relieved? Like, where were you? What was happening? Why were you relieved? You've got a whole theatre then in how you might convey this. So this is really important because emotion is something which we can control with primarily emotions driven through our imagination, how we perceive things occurring.
Yeah.
If we think about stress, fear, and anxiety, and we put it back into the connection with imagination, it overlaps, right? Because the way that you look at stress based on the summation of what's happened, that is, again, that's rooted in your imagination. Fear, or we can look at it as avoidance, if you like, is based on imagination. What do we perceive will happen? How will the threat look? And then, of course, when we look at that anxiety element, again, we can look at the future and say, well, how does that play out over a long period of time? So emotion is hugely rooted in our imagination, which is why it's important for us to accept that, but also we can control it. So what would the scenario be like if you were relaxed, if you were in control? People might say, I'd probably breathe slower. Okay. How would that play out? Give me some more information around that. Okay. I think they'll say things like, well, I feel like I'm more in control of my body movements. I feel like I'm not tensing up. My shoulders are relaxed. Okay. Tell me a bit more about this. But I'm not making quick choices. I'm making more deliberate responses. So again, emotion is hugely linked into how we think, but also how we act, which is why for us, using imagery, it's really important to connect those dots. Now, lots of other researchers. This isn't just just me saying these things. The biggest intervention in sport, PETLEP, which is the Dave Collins' approach ultimately around using imagery. I think it's been probably about 20 years now of loads of empirical studies in different areas, sport, medicine, all sorts of things. It improves performance consistently, alongside, of course, practice. You still need to practice. You can't just imagine. And then other work with Jennifer Cummings and colleagues, really around layering based responses. Similar approach. We're adding layers to your experience to immerse you and elaborate in multisensory detail.
Fascinating, John, and to say to everybody listening in, the PET-LEP model, as you mentioned there, John, and back in episode 212, we spoke to Dr. Matthew Scott, Professor Paul Holmes, who did the
Yeah,
original
that's right.
research around PET-LEP, with Professor Dave Collins and Dr. Dave Wright. They came on to the show to talk about the many years of research in that area. And just to say before we move on, and perhaps I'll get your comment on this in a minute, so much of what you said there resonated with me as a sports psychology practitioner, John, because so much of my work is entrenched in the notion of changing behavior by helping people manage their emotions so much of the time. And I feel language, meaning, and the body, so almost like an embodied form of cognition, if you like, language, meaning, and the body. I do so much work with athletes around that language, meaning, and the body, and a shift in body. That could be breathing, it could be a postural cue, it could be a change of pace, as simple as that, can change meaning. But utilizing language, as you said, well, what does relieved look like and feel like? Yeah, aggressive, alert, alive, lively, strong, just basic adjectives that change nouns. And when
Yeah.
people think about that and the meaning behind that, I find that that's a great way to help people consider emotion. So much of what you said there is so meaningful to my own work, John.
Yeah, and you know what? It's interesting because we've worked with a lot of psychologists over the last probably about 4 or 5 years, and the connection between that what you do, the cue or the body connection is really important. And the meaning behind the process goal is really key as well. So kind of merging it all together when working with athletes, that initial language control is usually what athletes might choose. Assertive, right? Well, what does that mean? And again, often, and I'm thinking about a golfer that I've worked with recently, who taps his thumb to get tempo. So that's his cue that he uses. But again, he's talking to himself around tempo. He's got 3 words that he says that activates performance. And I think, and again, these are frameworks. Frameworks are really important. And a lot of athletes are different to how they use the frameworks. And finding the right one, I think that's really what makes a good psychologist great, is working with an athlete to find what works best for them. Being a researcher, there are lots of interventions out there, but it's really merging together what works best for them and refining the approaches and incubating the ideas and getting some kind of reflection back and going again. And that's really quite important for that learning process.
We're going to aggressively agree on this one, John, because you've mentioned the magic word for me, their framework. So much of what I do is really just helping people establish the right, as you say, right for them mental framework that helps them take charge, take control of themselves in any given moment, which gets to the heart of your book, doesn't it?
No, exactly. Yeah. And I think every organization, we spoke about this before we went live today, but having a framework, every club, everyone needs a framework, and frameworks start from it. They should start from the why. Why are we doing this? Which should be merged within the values. And we're not going to talk about culture, but the culture of the club has to be based on a framework. And those who have those frameworks ingrained are the ones that will consistently go on to perform at a high level. And that's what we generally see in sport, is those with frameworks really go on to, as I say, be consistent over and over again. And that's hugely important, I think, as a takeaway.
Well, that's a lovely little segue, and I'm sure you did that on purpose to start talking about part 3 there, which is entitled Going Beyond. And very interestingly, here you hone in on imagery training for teams. I say interestingly because I think even for the most experienced of sports psychologists, looking at that can scare the living bejesus out of you, because when we think of imagery training, we're so used to doing it on an individual level, but on a team level, that feels so much more challenging. Because, to speak to your point just a couple of minutes ago, individual specificity, so many people are different in terms of the specific mental frameworks that they like to use. So I'm really excited to unpack this final part with you to speak about what you've written for your audience here. So tell me a little bit about part 3, Going Beyond.
Of course. So it is tricky, and don't think that it happened. Working with teams happened over a quick period of time. It happened over a number of years of getting it wrong a lot and going into teams and saying, we've had a psychologist in before doing these kind of things, and here we go again. Or it could be things around, players just aren't ready yet for they've got their own psychological skills they're using, and they're not ready to have them refined in any way. So often when I go in and work with teams, when I primarily started, it was a real challenge. So don't feel like it's if you're a psychologist working in industry and working with teams, I'm with you. I've struggled as well. So really for us, it's about the setup and about setting expectations or standards as we start. So I never run in and go, okay, guys, let's do some imagery training. It's always, we start off by developing what we would call team collaboration. We've got to collaborate and see where we are right now. And our role as psychologists is to meet the team where they are, give them some space to explore. Maybe it's goals, maybe it's just have conversations around how they're all connected. We need to have these vulnerable based discussions for them to connect to start off with, because when you're working with teams, or in fact anyone, their imagination is a very vulnerable area, right? You are working inside someone's head, right? You're working with someone on their goals, their aspirations, and some of these things they haven't achieved yet, of course. So it's an area of real trust. So building the trust is really important. So the research around thriving always brings me back to things around openness, trust, and understanding. There are always three things that I wear as well when delivering sessions, because thriving teams, we need to trust the process ultimately in each other, and we need to understand that we're all at different starting points when developing mental skills. So what we do to start off with is we build standards and expectations within our team, and really we look at how we can connect quickly with each other. Now, working with the military, again, that's a challenging group of people to work with, and they'll often inherit values. Like I've inherited values because we're all Royal Marines, and this is what this is what it looks like. So what we want to try and do is unpack your individual values, your individual why it's important for you to do this training or be in this team, and also the purpose. So so what? Like, what's beyond this? What's next for you? Tell us a bit more about you and the story about you and the narratives. And narratives and how you tell your story, again, involves imagination, right? So we start there. We meet them at this point of storytelling, the narratives, discussion around values, before we emerge them into shared goals and imagery-based training. But often, I often do these sessions where I'll stand in front of a group of 40, 50 people and say, yes, I'm a psychologist, and I can't read your mind. Doesn't mean I'm not a bad psychologist, but it's impossible. I can't read your mind, and you can't read each other's minds. But what I can tell you is right now you're thinking, is this going to be a good session? And you're going to have expectations of how this will go, and you are now in your own head. And that's great, because this is now part of self-talk. You're talking to yourself. This is great, which is the first stage of how we're going to work to develop your imagination. Then I'll say, has anyone here had an imagination coach before? And they generally say no. And so, why not? Like, surely you should all have imagination or imagery-based coaches. And that evokes conversation. And when we really focus in on team imagery, again, frameworks are really important. So we use what's called the 3 Ps. And every team might adapt this. Some teams might adopt it as it is. But the 3 Ps are, can you perceive external threats? What's our plan? The second P is plan. So what's our best route of progress? What can we do? What are our strengths? What are our setbacks? Let's be honest with each other. And then presence. How can I feel present in the here and the now? What can I do to ensure that I'm completing tasks, I'm communicating effectively? So perceive, plan, presence. And that's really our model that we use when we navigate through conversations around imagery training for teams in particular. And what we found is that teams often create this universal language of, like, when we feel present or when we are out of best self, there's communication that happens to kind of allow us to plan more effectively, to go back a stage. All right. So, and again, in football, often what we'll hear is players saying, okay, perceive, what's the threat? This is the threat. Okay. But what's the source of the threat? Like, where's it come from? How can we cut down the source of where, the ball's being fed into our attackers? Okay. What can we do? What's our plan? And they'll have these micro conversations in real time on the pitch. The ball might be thrown out, but they'll have these conversations and they'll have key words that enables them to refocus and sometimes reset. Reset is your more, something's happened and and we haven't thought about this happening. We're down a few goals. It could be, or a player sent off. How do we reset? So refocus and reset, again, 2 different things, words that we use with athletes to help them manage situations and to really use their imagery-based skills together as a team.
So, John, if I'm a coach listening in and I approach you and I say, okay, I hear what you're saying, John. That's awesome stuff. I love it. Just to check in with you here, last season we had 3 keywords or action-based words: energy, focus, and positivity. Energy, focus, and positivity. And every single day we were collectively striving in every activity, in every session, to meet the demands of these 3 words: energy, focus, positivity. We revolved some conversation around these 3 words. On game day, we set these words as prime behavioural objectives: energy, focus, positivity. To a degree, perhaps more in a layperson way, that coach might be doing something similar to what you're speaking to there.
Yeah, and the important part of this also is that the territory changes all the time.
Okay.
So, and what I mean by that is that these like 3 words, like keywords, are important because it gets people on the same sheet in terms
Yes.
of
Yes. A shared mental
understanding.
model. A
Sure,
shared mental model.
exactly. So super important. However, models need to be adapted.
Yes.
So it could be that that we need discipline to be on there, and we need to think about how we're going to be disciplined in certain areas of the pitch or on the ball or around a certain threat. Thinking about the other team as well, thinking about adapting keywords, adapting responses, and being able to to be flexible to what's in
Yes.
front of us.
Yeah.
Now, I always think like having 3 keywords is really important, or that amount in a game. But like values, they change over time,
Mm-hmm.
and like opposition, they change all the time. So again, the way that we often use it is we look at we perceive the threat, and then we come up with key words, for example, based on what we perceive for every individual team that we're going to play against. There may be some common things that we may stick with within our mental model, but ultimately we're going to adapt and we're going to set a plan based on what our strengths are as well. So that's the other important part, is that often, when I'm working with athletes, they'll often say they're almost overanalyze the threat and perceive the opposition. We've got a big player coming in, he's got lots of experience, and we need to cut that threat. But how about us? What's our edge? What's our USP? What are we uniquely good at as a collective? And then why don't we do that? Why don't we stick to what we've been practicing? Why don't we ensure that the plan suits us as well? I think that you can, I've seen it so many times in sport where you overanalyze and you don't think back to that internal kind of factor of what can I control? What's my process goal? And there's a podcast you did recently done around leadership, and I've done some research the last kind of couple of years with a team around pods. And pods meaning, if you have a team and you have a group of, let's say they are rugby players, and they're in the front row, well, who takes leadership in this front row? Who's the person that's is making decisions? How do they communicate together? When do they come together? What's the chat that they have? How do they imagine what will happen next? So within rugby teams in particular, I've been working with, this conversation is really important in these breaks that go on, to reset and to refocus. And these conversations often instigated, we have about 5 pods in a rugby club, in a rugby team. Pods could be the back 3, the fullback, the 2 wingers. It could be they come together, and they may just say sweeping distances. Okay, cool. I get it. I understand what you're saying. High ball. Make sure the threat around the high ball. Cool. Okay. Comms. Yeah, comms meaning communicate to me if you see anything. So they have a series of words that they may use, always adapting, evolving around the game plan, which evolve over time. So every team, as I say, is totally different. But having the framework, having that mental model, is really important for you to have those conversations, especially under pressure, in a very short way. And again, practice them in training. That's the other key part, is that you can't just implement things off the bat. They need to be very much practiced. which is why often, with a lot of teams, they select, what teams I'll be working with, they selected their team really early, their starting team very early in the weeks. And then they can, they understand then, they select them on Tuesday and you've got a match on Saturday. We've gone through the phases of play. We've gone through what we think the opposition is going to do. We've gone through our set plan, and we're going to really be present with our process goals.
I'm smiling, and you're the only person who can see me smiling, because I've been doing something using a pod system recently with a football team to principally to improve communication, but doing something very, very similar to what you're speaking to there. So absolutely resonates with me completely. And I thought I was the only one using that term pod. So damn you, John. Damn you.
You can have it. You can
No,
have it.
let's
It's all
share.
right.
Let's share. Let's share. I remember actually. I don't know the genesis of you using the term pod, but I remember reading Paul Azinger when he was the US Ryder Cup captain, and it was during a period of time when America was struggling with the relationship between their players, and as a nation, he wanted to help them come together. So he felt that actually stripping it back and creating, rather than I've got to get all these 11 people singing from the same song sheet, I'm just going to break this down into pods of 3 and 4, which at the time I think certainly in golfing terms was pretty unique, and he ended up being a winning captain for the US team. So I unashamedly stole that term off of.
No. Your story's a lot more, more exciting than mine. I've just we called them performance pods, and it was
Yeah,
literally
yeah,
conversations around what just debriefs, mini debriefs. What can we
yeah,
do next? And
yeah,
and weirdly, the pods in the rugby club, they go for performance pods coffees as well. They go out together, they
yeah.
review footage together, they have the conversations around the small process goals that they're working on for the matches. And again, they'll often play out, this is what we're going to do this weekend. These are the line out calls. Let's play that out. What does it look like? It's good that we're using the same terminology.
I'm conscious of your time, so we'll conclude things in a second. But I'm always conscious that trying to create shared mental models across 11, 15, 25 people, more if you're speaking about some American sports, is just you could use the term impossible here. So why not try to create a more efficacious shared mental models across a smaller group? Anyway, we could talk on that all day long. I want to close things out here by giving you the opportunity. There's 3 parts to this book. It's an exceptional book. I love reading it. I know the audience are going to love it. Just give us a couple of takeaways here, John, for those listening in. What 2 or 3 hints, tips, maybe lifted from the book, maybe summing up what we've spoken about today, can you give to our audience listening in?
Of course. So to start with, cues. You probably realise that cues are super important to activate your imagery. So find the right cue, I think, is the first big tip. And finding the right cue could take a bit of time. So experiment with what cues work best for you. And you may find that there are several cues. So you may have a morning cue. So for me, my morning cue is I get out of bed, and as my feet touch the floor, that cues me to go through my day and use imagery. So that is my first cue. I have several. I might have a cue where I can get stressed. Of course, I'm a psychologist. It's normal. I'm a human. And if I get stressed, recognizing it and then deep breath in, as I breathe out, that's my shoulders. And I'm then going to go into imagery mode. So cues are really important to start off with. And secondly, multi-sensory imagery. So visualization, great. That is one of 7 senses. Use imagery. Imagery is holistic, and emotion is your key there. Really, to really focus in on how you feel, especially under pressure. Like you're thinking about what can you do, but also how can you manage that stress under pressure. So really focus in on that. And again, in sport, movement, kinesthetic based imagery is important as well. So if you can use visual, kinesthetic movement, and emotion, that's going to be a game changer. And any other ones that you want to switch on will be added value as well. So you can think about smell, or things around temperature as well. So they're all going to be added value. And the more detail, the more elaboration, the better. So understand when you want to, recognize when you want to divert thinking based on values, and then really immerse yourself in that multi-sensory experience.
Jon, that's awesome. Thank you so much for that.
Pleasure.
That's been an absolutely fascinating hour and 5-10 minutes. Absolutely awesome. And I know you will have tapped the interest of those listening in. And I know that there are going to be many people out there who want to get a copy of your book, The Choice Point. So tell me, how can people find you, follow you, and purchase your book, The Choice Point?
Of course. So The Choice Point is available anywhere around the world. So very fortunate to have Hachette Go publish our book. So they are global, and Little Brown are publishers in the UK, and you can get it from Waterstones, from Amazon, from whatever your preference is. On Twitter, I am at Rhodes Psych. So you can follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Jon Rhodes, JONRHODES, PhD, or Instagram, anywhere.
Anywhere and everywhere. Brilliant stuff. Jon, thank you so much for today.
Thanks very much, Dan. Appreciate it. And I appreciate all the hard work that you do as well. I'm a big fan, so yeah, much appreciated.
Thank you, mate. Thank you. Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.